florals for spring, groundbreaking. But I actually have a very good reason to talk about flowers today. I recently rediscovered a very famous Gucci pattern, the so-called Flora pattern, and I think it's quite a good example of a very simple design. When we look at it, it looks quite simple at first, but when we do more research, we actually learn what is behind this simple design. And would you have believed this scarf is actually linked to two very famous Renaissance paintings? Now, what we are going to do today is we are going to look at the details of the scarf design, and we are also going to merge fashion and art history by traveling to the Uffizi galleries in Florence. And just a brief side note, this is a non-sponsored video, I'm just sharing my personal opinion and my research here. If you have seen the movie House of Gucci, you probably remember this really funny scene where Rodolfo Gucci, Jeremy Irons and Paolo Gucci, Jared Leto are in the room discussing Paolo's engagement with the Gucci brand. Or let's put it like this, Paolo really wanted to convince his uncle to take up his designs into the Gucci brand, and Rodolfo is not a fan of his designs at all. Paolo picks up a silk scarf and then he says, "You designed this scarf, correct?" "Oh yes, that scarf is my signature. It has caressed the necks of all the world's beauties. Jackie O, Grace, Sophia, study it closely. No browns, no pastels." It's quite obvious that Rodolfo was not a big fan of Paolo's designs in brown and pastels, and when he leaves the room, Paolo takes the scarf and throws it on the ground and urinates on it. While this scene was very funny in the movie, it never happened like this, it was fiction, but what is true is that Rodolfo was one of the creators behind the Flora scarf. And I say one of the creators here because the basic idea for the scarf was Rodolfo's, but he needed somebody else to bring it to life, and this was Italian artist Vittorio Aconero de Testa. And what is also interesting about the scarf is that it was developed almost by chance, and it was also made for a princess. In 1966, Princess Grace of Monaco came to Milan and she also visited the Gucci store in Via Monte Napoleone. By then, Gucci had already become very popular amongst the international jet set, and Rodolfo was also there to welcome her. The princess was browsing at the boutique, and Rodolfo was a very good businessman, so he wanted to give her a gift. And he asked her, "What would you appreciate?" And then the princess replied, "I would actually appreciate a silk scarf." And then Rodolfo was a bit startled because at that time Gucci did not really produce scarves or that many scarves. But he was quite clever and turned the situation around and just said, like, "This is perfect timing. We are currently developing a new scarf design. Let me send you that design once it's finished. And in the meantime, let me give you one of our iconic bamboo bags." He also had a conversation with her and asked her which patterns she appreciated, and she explained to him that she very much liked floral patterns. She was also kind of famous for that, so he also made a mental note for this and then started to develop the actual scarf. The result was the Flora pattern. Rodolfo called it an explosion of flowers, and as I said before, Vittorio Aconero de Testa brought it to life. And what is quite interesting about him is that it was not the first time he worked with a princess. He was an illustrator for children's books and he illustrated quite a few fairy tales, and he also designed costumes for the theater, the opera and for ballets. Fiorio then printed the scarf, and what is quite special is that they managed to print about 40 colors without bleeding. And this company is actually still around. They are part of a bigger group called Canepa today. And the design really is a beautiful explosion of flowers. There are also insects, and there is a very strong link to Gucci's hometown Florence. Because, as I mentioned in my introduction, there is this close link to two Renaissance paintings which are currently in the Uffizi galleries in Florence, and they are by Florentine artist Sandro Botticelli. Maybe you know them. One is Primavera, Spring, from about 1480, and the other one is the very famous Birth of Venus from about 1485. And now we are coming to this art history part. Let me briefly explain the iconography of the two paintings. So in the first one, in Primavera, we have Venus in the center. She is the center figure of both paintings. And in this Primavera painting, she is under an arch. She has this red cape or cloak around her, and above her is Cupid. He is blindfolded, and also his arrow points downwards. To her right, or when we look at the painting on the left, we have the three Graces, who are minor goddesses. They are dancing, and these goddesses have similar virtues to Venus. And next to them is Mercury. How do we know it is Mercury? As I mentioned in my video about the Oscars, attributes are always indicators like small objects, for example, to help identify saints or mythological figures or famous personalities. And in this case, we see the helmet, we see the winged sandals, and he's also holding the caduceus up to the sky towards the clouds. So we know this is Mercury. What is actually interesting for us, for our analysis of the scarf, is what's going on in the right part of the painting. We have the wind god Zephyrus, and he is kidnapping Chloris. She's a nymph, and he is going to transform her into a goddess. We see the transformation not only because of her movement, but also she has a flower in her mouth, indicating this transformation. And the main protagonist for us is actually not Venus. It's the figure next to Chloris. It's this woman who directly looks at us. She is actually Flora, the goddess of spring, and she wears this dress with all these flowers, maybe they are embroidered on it, and she also scatters roses to the ground. This painting is quite significant in art history overall because a lot of art historians actually argue what this painting actually depicts, but this is not so much our problem today. For us it is interesting because there are about 500 identified plants in the painting, 190 flowers, of which 130 were identified. And as I mentioned before, this painting is closely linked to another Botticelli painting, The Birth of Venus. I'm not going to give you an overview of the iconography and the background of this painting. There are plenty of other videos that you can watch for this. I want to focus on the details that are important for us for the analysis of the Flora scarf. So again, in the middle or in the center, we have Venus. She is directly looking at the viewer, at us. But again, she is not our main protagonist. We are also meeting Zephyr again, the wind god. This time he is with Aura, a minor wind goddess. And again, the main protagonist for us is on the right side of the painting. It's this female figure. Again, she has a very beautiful flower dress with a floral cloak also, and she could be either one of the three Graces or she could be one of the Hours and Aura. And because of the link with the flower details, it may be assumed that she is the Aura for spring. And we also see the roses again. The wind god blows the roses toward the center of the painting, and this is another link to the painting Primavera. Okay, art history lesson finished. I'm not going to bother you more. You are now asking me, Liz, why do we need to do all this art history analysis? What is this for? The reason is there are close similarities to our scarf, and one of the similarities is the number of flowers. I mentioned previously in both of the Botticelli paintings, there are quite a few hundred flowers actually depicted, and this is similar also in the scarf, not as many as in the paintings, but there's a multitude of flowers actually visible on the scarf. There are poppies, cornflowers, tulips, iris, daffodils, there's a water lily, there are ranunculi, hazel pollen, martacon lilies, there are also bellflowers, other lilies, and there's also rose hips and wild roses, which we can clearly see here because we see the stem with the thorns. And this is one of these very subtle links to the Botticelli paintings because the rose, as I said before, is one of the main storylines in the two paintings. And then I also sat down and tried to find the flowers that are directly referenced. What I could identify immediately is the cornflowers because they are also on the dress in The Birth of Venus that I mentioned before. And then it becomes a bit more difficult, I think, if I was at the Uffizi galleries and I could look at the paintings in more detail, it would be a bit easier. I had to do it with Google Arts, and then the zoom was a bit limited. And even though I could not identify every single flower for this reason, I think one thing is very clear. It's the style, how these flowers are painted, because I think this is very similar to the Botticelli paintings. And what is special about this scarf design is the symmetry approach, because it's quite similar to what I said in my video about the Hermès scarves. There is some basic symmetry. For example, in this case of the Gucci Flora pattern, it's a cross or an X. But this symmetry does not mean that there's one pattern which is repeated in the corners or on the sides, for example. Every part of that scarf is very unique, and this makes this scarf quite complicated and also quite expensive to make. And when I analyzed this scarf and also the symmetry, I actually did an experiment and turned the scarf upside down, because I think then the symmetry is a bit clearer. I found that there are actually two axes of symmetry. One is more ornamental flowers that we would find in groomed gardens. We have the tulips and the bellflowers on the one hand, and then across from them in the other corner we have the daffodils and the iris. And then the other part of that X would be, as we see, the cornflowers and the poppies. So we see the wildflowers that we would see in the fields, for example, and opposite of them in the other corner we have the wild roses, we have the rose hips, and also the holly. And another interpretation in terms of symmetry could be that one axis, the one with these rather groomed flowers, stands for spring, and the other axis of the cross stands for early summer and fall. And it's quite interesting because the name Flora itself would only relate to spring in the narrow sense, but this composition works so well that we have the seasons right next to each other and we actually don't really question it. And also in terms of colors, there's symmetry. On the one hand, we have the yellow daffodils. In the other corner, we then have the yellow tulips. There are also pink flowers in either corner. This is also the same in the other corners, that the colors are actually matched. And then even when we look at the center parts of the rim of this scarf, we see the blue, which is matched. And then also we see, for example, the white water lily, which is kind of mirrored by the white lily on the other side. And because we saw everything through the lens of an art historian, we also need to know here that, of course, every single flower can have its own meaning. It can be an allegory, and probably the most famous allegory is that the rose stands for love. And the color of these flowers is also important. For example, white lilies stand for purity, but in some countries they can also stand for death. In this scarf we have orange lilies in the center, and they stand for purity, femininity, and also beauty. And this may be deliberate, maybe it was a link to the beautiful Princess Grace. And what I also found interesting is because we have this white water lily, this may be a Nymphae Venus, which then would be another link to the Botticelli paintings. When the design was finished, it was printed in the format 90 x 90 centimeters, so quite a standard format, and it was hand delivered to the princess. Unfortunately, there are no pictures of the original scarf, but this pattern became a bestseller. It became very famous. Gucci later used it not only for other scarf designs, but also on other accessories, for example on bags. They used it for garments and also for jewelry. And since this iconic design, florals have become an intrinsic part of the Gucci DNA. There have been many other floral designs. One example is here, this beautiful scarf also, but they didn't limit themselves to floral scarves. Florals were also taken up in garments, other accessories, bags, for example, or even jewelry. Why was this so significant for Gucci? Of course, it was the exposure, and then also people loved it, so people bought the product. But it was also significant in terms of design because they moved away from the equestrian patterns. So they basically gave the brand a new dimension, maybe an even more feminine dimension. And over the decades, this scarf has been reinterpreted many times. For example, the flowers have been printed on top of the Gucci logo pattern. It has been printed in many different colors, and there's even one interpretation where there was a snake in that whole flower composition, and this was basically added from the Gucci garden. What I personally really like is this generational aspect or family aspect of the Flora pattern, because it kind of feels as if the Flora pattern has been handed down in Princess Grace's family, because later on in the 1970s her daughter Caroline wore a blouse with this print for a shooting for Vogue, and then much later on Princess Grace's granddaughter, Caroline's daughter Charlotte Casiraghi, was the face of the Gucci Forever Now campaign, and she also wore the Flora scarf. And probably one of the biggest revivals of this pattern was in the early 2000s under Frida Giannini. She was Tom Ford's successor as creative director at Gucci, and she put this pattern on handbags but also on scarves, for example. And this is when it became really popular. It became one of her first successes for Gucci and also probably one of her biggest successes. This was also when I discovered that pattern and actually really liked it. And Giannini obviously liked this pattern so much that she launched a perfume named Flora in 2010, and also her successor Alessandro Michele launched a perfume, a Flora perfume, the Flora Gorgeous Gardenia, in 2021. This was also at the occasion of the 100th anniversary of the brand. He collaborated with Miley Cyrus, and for the bottle design he actually took up the original design of the Flora pattern for Princess Grace. And Alessandro Michele was very fond of the Flora pattern because there are many reinterpretations in his collections for Gucci. For example, the Cruise collection of 2017. This is also the same year when he launched the fragrance Bloom for the brand. So again, we see he's very fond of flora and fauna, and we also see this in many other collections. For example, in Spring Summer 2016, Fall Winter 2017, or also the Cruise collection 2019. And this flora motif actually went beyond the mere garment design of Gucci, because in 2014 under Frida Giannini, Gucci participated in the Chelsea Flower Show with a Gucci garden, and they actually won an award for it. It was actually quite a genius marketing idea, because at the same time they were promoting Flora products. And another part of this marketing strategy was also an exhibition called Flora Icon, which traveled around the world, and there were many things on display, not only the scarf design but also original sketches by Vittorio Aconero de Testa, and also garments and accessories from the Gucci Museum in Florence. And also Alessandro Michele, our fan of flora and fauna, created a Gucci garden in the Palazzo della Mercanzia in Florence, which was previously the Gucci Museum, and there's one room dedicated to flora and fauna and also the Flora pattern. And we have also reached the end of my video about this iconic Gucci Flora design. I hope you enjoyed this brief excursion also into art history. I very much did, because this is the reason why I love fashion so much, because I always want to know more about the background of the designs. Why did the designer come up with this particular garment or accessory? I know in more recent times it feels kind of random. Sometimes it's just weird what is going on in the fashion industry. I feel sometimes it's more about marketing or focus groups, but there are many examples where we can actually see that designers do put a lot of thought into their creations. And I think the Gucci Flora pattern is a very good example for this, because let's be honest, at first sight this is a flower scarf. It's pretty, but we would not assume too much. And this actually reminded me of the courses at university where we had to analyze paintings which looked at first sight really boring, and then you did the research and then you found out so many interesting details about it. And similarly, I had this feeling with the Flora scarf when I dove deeper into the analysis. So I hope you also found this interesting. If you did, please don't forget to like and subscribe. You can also head over to thepinklookbook.com for more fashion related articles. And if you're interested, you can also check out my own fashion brand Pelagona. And if you liked this video, I have other videos also about scarf designs, for example, the history of the Hermes scarf, so you may find that interesting. Thank you very much for watching this video, and see you in the next one.